You know that feeling when you've spent hours, and I mean literally hours, staring at a stack of vocabulary flashcards, perfectly memorizing a list of foreign words, only to completely blank out when you actually try to use them in a real conversation, and you just end up awkwardly saying bonjour for the fifth time? It is incredibly frustrating, isn't it? Well, you are definitely not alone. That disconnect happens because rote memorization treats language like a static list of data. Today, we're going to explore why isolated memorization falls short and how we can use a modern relational approach to truly acquire a language. Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're tackling a really foundational topic today, 47, vocabulary acquisition and text selection in language teaching. For the longest time, traditional pedagogical frameworks operated under this very grammar-first mindset. Syntax was the undisputed king of the classroom. But contemporary linguistics has totally shifted gears. We now understand that without sufficient vocabulary, no meaningful communication can happen at all. In this explainer, we're going to completely dismantle that outdated approach and reveal how vocabulary actually works in the mind of a learner. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover the vital lexical infrastructure, the social life of words, the dynamic language store, practical teaching and learning techniques, and finally, the power of text selection. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The vital lexical infrastructure. Like I mentioned just a moment ago, historically, syntax was the undisputed king of language teaching. But here's the reality check. You can memorize all the grammar rules in the world, but if you don't actually have the words to plug into those structures, you simply cannot communicate. The lexicon, the vocabulary itself, is the true vital infrastructure. And here's the cool part. Our brains don't store these words like some boring alphabetical dictionary or a rigid spreadsheet, not at all. As you can see, vocabulary acquisition is this incredibly complex, multidimensional process. The mental lexicon is a dynamic, interconnected neurological web. So knowing a word isn't just knowing its translation, it's understanding its meaning, its usage, its grammatical quirks, and exactly how it relates to every other word in this massive mental ecosystem. Now, to actually understand this web, we need to look at its basic building block. In the world of semantic analysis, this core unit is called a lexeme. Basically, a lexeme is a single unit of meaning, completely regardless of its grammatical variance. So walk, walks, and walked, they all belong to the exact same lexeme. If you think of our mental lexicon as a giant social network, the lexeme is essentially the individual person hanging out in that network. Section 2. The social life of words. So, looking at it from a structuralist perspective, a language is fundamentally a network of systematic relationships between these individual lexemes. Because, let's face it, words don't just exist in a vacuum, right? Their meaning is largely defined by how they interact and relate to the other words around them. And these interactions generally happen along two main axes, syntagmatic and paradigmatic relationships. Syntagmatic relationships are all about who words hang out with sequentially. Think about collocations, words that predictably show up together, like the phrase green with envy. This kind of stuff is a huge headache for language learners because, honestly, these pairings rarely have a logical deduction. It's just the way the language works. Paradigmatic relationships, on the flip side, are all about substitution, meaning which words can be swapped out for one another in the exact same grammatical slot. Understanding this paradigmatic axis is absolutely crucial because it's kind of like the secret code behind word substitution. There are a few key ways words relate here. First up, we've got synonymy, which is sameness of meaning. Though, fun fact, true exact synonyms are actually pretty rare. Then there's hyponymy, which is a relationship of inclusion. Think of how the broad superordinate term fruit includes hyponyms like apple or orange. We also have antonymy or opposites. These can be binary, like male and female, interdependent, like buy and sell, or gradable, like big and small. And finally, incompatibility, which means mutually exclusive members of the same category. It's literally the linguistic reason why you can't be both red and green with envy at the same time. Teachers actually use something called componential analysis, which is basically a matrix of positive and negative markers to help students untangle the fine nuances between these similar lexemes. And that brings us to a really beautiful concept about how we actually acquire language. Researchers Morgan and Rinvolucri describe vocabulary learning as, quote, making friends with the words of the target language. I absolutely love that framing. It totally shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It emphasizes that acquiring words isn't some cold, mechanical act of isolated memorization. It's a relational process. It requires personal, affective connections. How impactful your first encounter with a word is, and how relevant it is to your immediate needs, completely determines whether that word is going to stick around or not. Section 3, the dynamic language store. Well, if we're busy making friends with all these words, we obviously need a place for them to live. Modern methodology tells us we need to stop viewing a learner's mind as having rigid little boxes of known and unknown words. Instead, it's more like a fluid, dynamic language store or a personal linguistic corpus. As you can see right here, words are constantly shifting back and forth between active vocabulary, those are the words you can confidently use in a sentence, and passive vocabulary, the ones you recognize when you hear them but maybe aren't quite ready to use yourself. A word doesn't just get locked into one category forever. Depending on how often you use it and contextual activation, its status is always evolving in your mind. Section 4, Teaching and Learning Techniques. Okay, so we've got the theory down. We know we need to build this dynamic language store and help students make friends with words, but how do we actually pull this off in a classroom? How do we spark those meaningful connections? Well, when introducing new lexical items, they absolutely have to be presented in a familiar, meaningful context to allow for genuine discovery. Teachers generally lean on 3 main categories of techniques for this. First, visual techniques. This means using realia, which is just a fancy word for real-world objects, or visual aids and gestures. These are total game changers for concrete vocabulary, especially if you're a beginner. Second, we have verbal techniques. This is where you create illustrative situations for more abstract concepts or use scales and definitions. And third, translation. Now, I know translation can be a bit controversial in language teaching circles, but it honestly remains a highly time-efficient way to convey complex meanings, provided it doesn't just become a crutch that replaces actually using the target language framework. But hey, teaching isn't just about standing at the front of the room presenting words. It's about empowering the learner to become their own language detective. To really foster that independent, autonomous learning, students need to develop metacognitive strategies so they can tackle unknown vocabulary all on their own. This means building strong dictionary skills like the double search technique, which helps you accurately distinguish between tricky synonyms. It also means sharpening those contextual deduction skills, so when you're naturally reading or listening, you can play detective and infer what a new word means right from its context. Section 5. The power of text selection. So where do all these words actually live out in the wild? They live in texts. And for students to encounter these words naturally, teachers have to play curator and carefully select the text used in class. This isn't just a random guessing game either. It's driven by scientific criteria like frequency, meaning how often do native speakers actually use this word, and coverage. How many different situations does this word apply to? Actually, digital tools like the CoBuild corpus provide these amazing data-driven frequency lists that have completely revolutionized how we curate materials. But when making these choices, teachers are always weighing authentic texts against simulated authentic texts. Let's break that down. Authentic materials, think real newspaper articles, YouTube clips, or menus, are created for non-teaching purposes. Engaging with them is the holy grail, the ultimate goal for achieving true communicative competence. But their complex sentence structures and high density of unknown words can completely overwhelm a beginner. It's like throwing them in the deep end. That's exactly where simulated authentic texts come to the rescue. They look and feel like real communication, but they feature carefully controlled language and editing. They provide that crucial scaffolding, letting learners develop their skills without just drowning in complexity. As we pull all of these threads together, the big takeaway is this: mastering the lexicon is a multidimensional journey. The absolute most effective vocabulary development happens when we create a synergy between 2 approaches. It takes explicit instruction, the direct teaching of items, definitions, and focused practice, integrated seamlessly with implicit acquisition, where students are just absorbing words naturally through extensive reading and listening to really well-selected texts. It is exactly this combination that builds that dynamic language store you need for real-world interaction. So we've clearly moved way past the days of boring rote memorization. We've seen that words are basically a giant social network, and that truly learning them is all about making meaningful contextual connections. So I want to leave you with this final thought to consider. Based on this relational network approach, how are you going to change your strategy for making friends with the very next new word you try to learn or teach? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring those linguistic connections.